The Victorian historian Thomas Carlyle claimed that the Teutonic Knights were more historically important than the Knights Templar. How could he believe this when the Knights Templar are so much more famous? Well, while the Knights Templar helped pioneer the European banking system, their time was cut short by a French king in 1307, not even 200 years after their founding. In contrast, the Teutonic Knights still exist today, and only a few decades after they were initially founded, they began constructing one of the most important European states of all time, Prussia. In the beginning, this state was quite literally called the Teutonic State. I'm certain almost everyone watching this video received a Prussian education. And I assume that if you are watching this video, you love history. A professor at the Prussian University of Berlin, Leopold von Ranke, is responsible for the emphasis on sources and objectivity in history. Also, if you go to university for history, he is the reason why you will have seminars. I'm just scratching the surface here about Prussia's significance. And it is worth noting that Carlyle made that claim about the Teutonic Knights being more important than the Templars, even before Prussia achieved its greatest accomplishment, the 1871 unification of Germany by Otto von Bismarck. If the Teutonic Knights are so important, you're probably wondering why you have heard so little about them. Well, the historian William Urban argues that there are 3 reasons for the Knights being somewhat forgotten. The first is understandable. Jerusalem was obviously the Crusaders' main objective, and so historians focus more on the Middle Eastern Crusades than on others. While the Teutonic Knights were involved in Middle Eastern Crusades, their most significant crusading efforts were in the Baltic region, particularly Prussia and Livonia. Livonia encompassed modern Estonia and Latvia. The second reason for the Knights' neglect is an extremely difficult language barrier. Essentially, a historian must be familiar with the many languages of Eastern Central Europe and the Baltic to understand historical records relating to the Teutonic Knights. But the third problem was that even if a historian knew all these languages, the Cold War made it nearly impossible for Western and Eastern historians to access each other's nations. And of course, you cannot write a history without access to archives and without the ability to examine important historical sites. But now that we understand why the Teutonic Knights have been neglected, why don't we begin their story? To understand the context of the crusading world that gave rise to the Teutonic Knights, we must look all the way back to the Roman Empire. You probably know that the Roman Empire collapsed roughly around 500 AD according to traditional historical scholarship. Most commonly, historians have marked September 4th, 476 AD as the date. This was the day the Germanic warrior Odoacer deposed Emperor Romulus Augustulus. But the Roman Empire survived in the East for about another 1,000 years. And even before the fall of the Western Empire, the Eastern Empire was already deemed more important. Not only because in the year 330, the capital became the eastern city of Constantinople, but also because the Eastern Empire contained Middle Eastern religious sites such as Jerusalem. These were important to the empire's new religion, Christianity, which was made a state religion in the years 380. Historians typically call the Eastern Roman Empire the Byzantine Empire because it became culturally Greek instead of Latin. But the difference between Rome and Byzantium is not our focus. I have brought up the Byzantine Empire because it is of the utmost importance to understanding why the Crusades happened. The foundation for the Crusades was laid in the 7th century when warriors following the new religion of Islam quickly conquered all of the Byzantine Empire's Middle Eastern territory, including Jerusalem. Following that massive loss, the Turks began expanding into the empire's territory in Asia Minor in the 11th century. Even though the Western and Eastern churches had just split into Catholic and Eastern Orthodox in 1054, this newest threat prompted the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos to ask Pope Urban II for aid to recover the Asia Minor territories in the year 1095. Pope Urban saw an opportunity. He could end wars between Christians in Europe and instead direct them toward not only pushing the Turks out of Asia Minor, but also regaining Jerusalem. He was successful, and he managed to unite all Christians in the First Crusade. This crusade resulted in the capture of Jerusalem and other nearby territories in the year 1099. But a little less than 50 years later, the Crusaders lost Edessa, one of the cities they had captured, prompting the Second Crusade in the year 1147. While they failed to take back Edessa, they held on to Jerusalem. Though they had kept the prized city, this was not to last. About 40 years later, the famous Saladin successfully captured Jerusalem. In response, The Crusaders set out on the Third Crusade in 1189. This crusade is most well known for the mutual admiration Richard the Lionheart and Saladin had for each other. But it was also the crusade that created the Teutonic Order. During the Third Crusade, the German Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa suddenly drowned after achieving great victories against the Turks. This proved to be a disaster for the German Crusaders. Many of the leading nobles returned to Germany with their armies. They had to prevent civil war and take part in the election of a new emperor. Without the presence of their emperor and most of their nobles, the remaining German Crusaders suffered. They had to rely on the French and English leadership. Normally, the only issue with this would be a language barrier. However, there was another issue at play. King Richard the Lionheart of England had a rivalry with the German emperors. Importantly, this rivalry not only put the Germans at odds with the English but also with the French. This was because the Norman conquest of England placed England under the rule of French aristocrats. The strained relationship between German emperors and King Richard meant that Germans found themselves neglected by English and French elites and institutions. However, since the Germans had few of their own nobles with them, they were dependent on these elites and institutions. This turned into a catastrophe when the Crusaders began to besiege the city of Acre in 1189. Dead bodies were in the drinking water, which was unusually hot due to the Mediterranean climate unfamiliar to the Northern Crusaders. Even more terrifying, insects were feasting on the barely living. All this contributed to severe disease outbreaks. Without anyone to stand up for them, the German Crusaders found themselves not receiving medical care. Thomas Carlyle records, quote, "The very Templars, Hospitallers, neglect us," murmured the dying Germans. They had perhaps enough to do, and more than enough with their own countrymen, whose speech is intelligible to them. For us, it would appear there is no help. End quote. However, it was this tragedy that faced the German Crusaders that prompted the creation of the Teutonic Order. In the year 1190, German merchants created a hospital to assist the sick. A year later, in 1191, they received approval from Pope Clement III to become an official hospital order called the Order of the Hospital of St. Mary of the Germans in Jerusalem. For short, the German Order, but more commonly, the Teutonic Order. Now, before we delve deeper into this story, we must look at how history is written. This is because history is always somewhat a reflection of historians, and thus, this particular video is the result of what I have read. In making this video, I mostly relied on Thomas Carlyle's History of Friedrich II of Prussia and 3 books of William Urban's, The Teutonic Knights, as well as The Teutonic Knights Strike East, the 14th century Crusades in Lithuania and Rus. Urban collaborated with Darius Baronas for this book. And finally, The Last Years of the Teutonic Knights, Lithuania, Poland, and the Teutonic Order. I chose Carlyle and Urban because they differ from each other in almost every way. Carlyle was a Scottish historian, but also an essayist and philosopher, meaning his scholarly background was quite broad. Urban is an American military historian with a primary focus on the Teutonic Knights, meaning he has a much more specialized and narrow focus. But most importantly, their manner of writing history completely differs from one another. And they differ because of the historian Leopold von Ranke, whom I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Von Ranke thought historians should only establish what happened and not what that should mean. This is because he believed that if humans did not insert their own ideas into history, the hand of God could be observed. Since Carlyle was born in 1795, the same year as von Ranke, objective history was not yet the norm when Carlyle wrote. It is for this reason that Carlyle's history focuses on great men and not just on laying out historical details. In fact, it is worth noting that Thomas Carlyle actually created the idea of the great man of history, demonstrating a clear overlap of his philosophical nature with his historical interest. In contrast to Carlyle's history with a message, William Urban is from our own era and thus highly influenced by von Ranke's objective history. That is why he focuses on seemingly small details instead of just large personalities. Urban is probably more objective than many historians because he is a military historian, a school of history that, due to its highly analytical focus on tactical maneuvers and logistics, leaves little room for the insertion of one's own beliefs about more fundamental aspects of life, such as morality. Another aspect particular to Urban that results in his objective writing is his awareness of unobjective writing in history and his conscious decision to avoid following that path. He believes that modern nationalism, which was not present in the Middle Ages, has led historians to exaggerate either the good or bad aspects of the Teutonic Knights, fundamentally distorting how they are remembered. Urban believes that his works on the Knights help correct these nationally driven narratives. Essentially, Urban is trying to ensure historians still follow the rules established by von Ranke. The different ways these two historians write history affects how the Knights are described. As Carlyle is building a great man narrative, the Knights are usually presented heroically. As Urban tries to be objective, they come across as morally gray, capable of both great state building and iron discipline, but also of corruption and significant acts of violence. However, I would like to clarify that despite the morally gray portrayal, Urban is certainly not presenting a narrative that could be deemed as an attack against the Knights. In fact, as we will see later, Urban is sometimes quite sympathetic to the Knights compared to other historians. We will even see him arguing that certain misdeeds have been exaggerated and taken out of context, and believing that the legal justification the Knights often used was actually legitimate, despite other historians believing these legal mechanisms were fabrications. The reason why Urban might seem to be somewhat aggressive toward the Teutonic Knights is most likely the contrast with Thomas Carlyle's explicitly heroic narrative. These differences between the two historians are further amplified by the scope of their text. While Carlyle's book is a behemoth, it took him around 13 to 14 years to write. Only a few chapters cover the Knights. This is because the book's focus is on Friedrich the Great. That means that Carlyle only includes the most important aspects of the Teutonic Knights' history, while cutting the rest. The result is that there was mainly only room left for the Knights' successes and heroism. In contrast, Urban's entire book focuses solely on the Knights. This allowed him to include their misdeeds and moments of weakness along with their triumphs. A result of the difference in scope that you will notice when watching this video is that Carlyle will eventually fade from my narrative as Urban slowly becomes the sole focus. This is simply for the reason that there was no longer any more information I could draw from Carlyle regarding the Knights. If you want to get into reading about the Teutonic Knights now or after this video, here's my recommendation. Let Carlyle paint the outline of the painting, and then let Urban fill it in. Because Carlyle's chapters on the Knights are way shorter than Urban's full book, and present a clear heroic narrative, it will give you an easy outline to work with. Then, when you read Urban's work, you will be able to fit in all that extra detail into that framework. And Urban's morally great portrayal of the Knights will make your brain work to determine whether you agree with his presentation or Carlyle's. This kind of debate within your own mind will get you thinking about the significance of the Knights. Also, you can read Carlyle's book right away as it is free on Project Gutenberg since it is out of copyright. My pinned comment will guide you to it. However, one further thing I would like to suggest is that if you are still interested in the Knights after reading both authors, definitely check out other historians' work on this topic, as many aspects of this history depend on the particular historian. Seeing significantly different presentations of the same events will help with critical thinking. Now, let's return to the story of the Teutonic Knights. So we left off with German merchants forming a hospital at the besieged city of Acre in 1190, which became the official Teutonic Order in 1191. Right away, Carlyle and Urban differ regarding this early event. Carlyle specifically highlights the leadership of a particular merchant, Walpott von Bessenheim, in creating the order. Urban, on the other hand, does not define a specific leader, as he, unlike Carlyle, does not use the great man of history narrative. Instead, Urban attributes the creation of the hospital to the German merchants in general. Another major difference is that Carlyle glosses over the fact that the order needed permission from Pope Celestine III to become official. This makes it seem as though Walpott von Bessenheim and his followers created the order solely through their own efforts. This is in contrast to Urban, who emphasizes that it took the collective effort of Duke Friedrich of the Imperial House of Hohenstaufen, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, the Hospitallers, and the Templars to bring the German hospital's attention to the Pope. Carlyle also misses an important detail that Urban includes, that the Teutonic Order was meant for medical service, not combat, even after it became official. But why did the order transition from primarily a hospital order to an order of knights? This transition occurred in response to almost the exact same situation that led to the Teutonic Order's founding. In 1197, the Holy Roman Emperor Heinrich VI, son of the deceased Emperor Barbarossa, launched his own crusade. the German Crusade, to fulfill what his father could not. Yet just like his father, he suddenly died, in his case of disease, only a month into the crusade. This once again left the German Crusaders in absolute shambles. Many of their number returned home again. This meant the Germans needed every fighting man they could get, and they happened to notice that many of the Teutonic Order had received knightly training prior to taking their vows. For this reason, these crusaders requested that the Pope make the Teutonic Order a military order. The Pope agreed, and in 1198 the Teutonic Order was no longer an order of nurses, but an order of knights. What was life like for a Teutonic Knight? Being warrior monks, the knights had to be able to live a lifestyle of both military and religious discipline. You can imagine that this would be quite difficult, as both forms of discipline are seen as extremely difficult to conform to on their own. For the religious aspect, the knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Furthermore, they were not to own anything, but instead share everything with their newfound brothers. With these brothers, they would attend frequent religious services and even, when possible, tend the sick, even after the order became militarized. For clothing, they were to wear a white mantle, bearing a black cross. Beneath this mantle, their clothing was meant to be priestly in appearance. For their military aspect, the knights were given armor, weapons, and horses, and were allowed to hunt. Hunting was a privilege specifically granted to them by the papacy, because it was usually seen as contrary to the monastic lifestyle. However, hunting taught the knights geography while physically strengthening them, and thus was a great way to develop their military skills. Furthermore, with most of the knights being German, and Germany being a more forest and wild land at this point in time, hunting was common amongst Germans, and to forbid it would have been very unpopular amongst them. Though, to ensure that hunting did not entirely violate monasticism, the knights were supposed to hunt only out of necessity, not for pleasure or for thrill. An interesting development noted by Urban is that between 1310 and 1350, the knights significantly reduced their monasticism and replaced it with the chivalry common amongst secular knights of that time. This meant that instead of living frugal lives, they hosted luxurious feasts among other events, but were also generous with this wealth and honorable. The significance of this transformation and how it occurred will be explored later in the video. However, before moving on, I would like to clarify something. There is a belief that the Teutonic Knights' helmets had horns. This is a misconception, just as people even today believe that the Vikings had horns on their helmets when in reality they did not. The Teutonic Knights did add wings to their helmets during public displays, especially during tournaments, but these were not used in battle so as to avoid them interfering with combat. The belief that their helmets were horned likely comes from the depiction of the knights in Eisenstein's film Alexander Nevsky. As the knights were antagonists in that film, the horns were likely put on their helmets to give them a devilish appearance. Now that I have cleared that up, I will move on to the order structure. There is a pop culture comparison to the Teutonic Order that makes understanding its structure and purpose very easy. That is the Jedi Order from Star Wars. In that film series, the Jedi are an order of warrior monks like the Teutonic Order. The Jedi Order has one Jedi Grand Master, Yoda, a few masters like Obi-Wan Kenobi, and a lot of Jedi Knights like Anakin. The Teutonic Order likewise had one Grand Master, a few masters, and a good number of knights. The only real difference is that the Teutonic Knights had a little more complexity within that structure. Placed in rank between the overarching Grand Master, who once elected served for life, and the masters of local regions, there were the various high officers. They provided the Grand Master with counsel in regard to specific aspects of the Order's operation. One high officer was a treasurer, one was a marshal, another was a Grand Commander, a kind of Vice Grand Master. These three possessed 3 keys, all of which were needed to open the huge chest containing much of the Order's wealth, which ensured power was dispersed amongst them. There were also 2 other high officers who were technically subordinate to the marshal, though Urban notes that this was never really the case, as they were in practice equal besides not having keys. One was the Master of Robes, who managed clothing and armor, and the other was the commander of the hospital. There are more similarities with the Jedi that will make the Knights more familiar to you. Like how the Jedi in the movies had to negotiate with the Republic, the Teutonic Order also negotiated with the Papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, and the many monarchs of Europe. And like how the Jedi stamped out threats to the Republic, like the Separatists, the Teutonic Knights, on behalf of the Papacy, the Empire, and monarchs, crusaded against non-Christians, whether Muslim or pagan, and later on, even battled pirates on their own behalf. As you can see, the similarities between the Jedi and the Teutonic Knights are quite apparent. So if you want to remember what the Knights were like easily, just think of Christian Jedi. If I may go slightly off topic for a moment, the Knights Templar are even more similar to the Jedi because, like how the Jedi were almost wiped out by Order 66 issued by the Republic that once backed them, the Templars were condemned to death by the papacy and the French monarch, both of which had backed them before. But unlike the fall of the Jedi and the Templars, the Teutonic Knights' downfall came from within, but that is for later in this video. For now, I will return to the early history of the Teutonic Knights. As you will know based on this video's intro, the Teutonic Knights' biggest impact was on Prussia, so you probably want to know how they ended up there. It's a long story, and Carlyle and Urban utterly disagree with how it happened. I will present you with both of their views. Carlyle argues that the 4th Grand Master, Hermann von der Salza, knew that crusading in the Levant was a lost cause. He recognized that the powerful Sultan Saladin, during the Third Crusade, had been a man of honor whose word could be trusted, as Saladin had promised to protect pilgrims. One major reason for the Crusades and military orders in the Middle East had been removed during his lifetime. Hermann von der Salza recognized that even though Saladin had been deceased for years, by the time he became Grand Master in 1210, the safety he had given to pilgrims, combined with his having won so many battles against crusaders, had caused secular lords to lose their crusading zeal. This shift was particularly evident when crusaders pillaged Eastern Orthodox Christian Constantinople instead of attacking Islamic Egypt during the Fourth Crusade. Without secular support, crusades would lack manpower and additional resources. Thus, lacking purpose and resources, the Grand Master concluded he had to leave the Levant and find a new purpose in Europe. By the time the entire Crusader presence in the Levant was lost, the Teutonic Knights were crusading in Prussia. Thus, the Grand Master's ability to foresee the future saved the order from becoming purposeless without the Levant. Carlyle claims their new purpose saved them from the fate of the Templars. He believes that after the loss of the Levant, the Templars, instead of pursuing new goals, chose to enrich themselves. This ultimately led to their destruction at the hands of the French king, who wanted to erase his debts to the order and steal their wealth. Overall, Carlyle presents the Grand Master as the genius who saved the Teutonic Order. William Urban completely disagrees with this narrative. He claims that the Teutonic Knights did not willingly leave the Levant. They were unwillingly pushed out. How could he have come to such a different conclusion from Carlyle? His differing focus. While Carlyle focuses on the actions of the Grand Master, Urban examines the administrative side of the Teutonic Order, and he notes that it was still diverting most of its resources to the Levant. For this reason, he concludes that the Order had no intention of leaving the region. Urban also digs up an interesting, albeit very important detail. He finds that the Grand Master viewed Prussia as far less important than the rest of his territories. Despite this disagreement between these two historians, one interesting thing to note is that the Teutonic Knights' first venture in Europe was actually not in Prussia. It was in Hungary. In 1211, King Andrew II of Hungary invited the Knights to Transylvania. Why? Well, the mountain chain that protected Hungary transitioned to forested hill country in Transylvania. This allowed the pagan Cumans to easily invade Hungary. The king had tried to fix the problem himself, but to no avail. Transylvania was only sparsely inhabited by Hungarians, and the king's vassals in the region lacked the resources to resist. While it was obvious why the Hungarian king needed support, direct evidence for why the king invited the Teutonic Order in particular is unavailable. William Urban tries to answer this question with his own careful judgment. He determines that the king likely invited the Teutonic Order because of his vassal, Count Hermann of Thuringia. Urban has a few points justifying this view. Firstly, there was a strong connection between the Count and the Grand Master. The family the Grand Master belonged to, the Zalzas, were loyal vassals of the Count. This is perhaps the reason why the Grand Master was given the same name, Hermann, as the Count. Furthermore, the Count's family had gone on crusades. The Count's father had even been present at the transformation of the Teutonic Order into a military order, and perhaps was accompanied by Salza, who joined the order. Secondly, it is known that the Count introduced Grand Master Hermann von der Salza to the king. Thirdly, the king invited the order shortly after signing a marriage contract between the Hungarian princess and the Count's son. Thus, Urban supposes that it was highly probable that the Hungarian king, now bound by family to the Count, was significantly susceptible to his influence. With the strong connection between the Salzas and the Count's family, Urban reasonably concludes that the Count suggested to the king that the Teutonic Knights were the solution to his problem. Whether this was the case or not, The Hungarian king did invite the order to Transylvania, to which they accepted. To entice the knights, the king promised them lands in Transylvania, where the order, and not himself, could impose taxes and justice, as well as establish markets. In exchange, the order was to accept that only the Hungarian king could coin money, and that they had to hand over half of any silver or gold discovered to him. Once in Transylvania, the Teutonic Order had a brilliant idea to better deal with the invaders. Instead of just trying to keep them out of Hungary, the Order recognized that the Cumans had a core weakness. While their nomadic lifestyle made it easy for them to invade Hungary, it also meant that in their own lands, they lacked strongly fortified settlements. Thus, the Order decided that instead of just protecting the border, it was more effective for them to invade the Cumans' territory. Essentially, the Order took the belief that the best defense is a good offense. This led to a massive success. The Order quickly went through the lightly held Cuman lands with little opposition, and they began to populate it with German settlers. The Cumans could not counterattack as the Knights built castles to live in. The Knights moved through Cuman territory so quickly that Urban believes that in another decade they would have, quote, probably have pushed down the Danube River to occupy all the territories down to the Black Sea, end quote. This would have removed the pressure the Cumans had placed not only on Hungary but also on Constantinople, which was currently Latin and Catholic, not Greek and Orthodox, due to the Fourth Crusade. This would have allowed the Knights to reopen the land route to Constantinople, which had been too dangerous for Crusaders for years. This could have potentially allowed for new crusades in the Levant. However, none of this was to be, for the Knights' rapid success attracted the ire of the Hungarian nobles. The nobles argued that the Order was supposed to only defend the border. They were not supposed to expand. The nobles feared that the Order was creating its own kingdom within Hungary. The nobles demanded that the king withdraw the privileges that he had granted the knights. Luckily for the knights, the king did not agree with the nobles. However, Hermann von der Salza would make a mistake that ultimately destroyed the king's trust in the Order. The Grand Master observed that while the king appreciated the Order, his heir, Prince Bela, sided with the nobles. The Grand Master believed it was then only a matter of time before he would inevitably lose all the lands he had gained. Thus, he discussed with the Pope about how he could avoid this. What followed was that the Pope essentially transferred the overlordship of the Order's lands from the king to himself. The king was outraged and thus expelled the Order in 1225. He even gave Prince Bela permission to use an armed force to drive them out of Hungary if they would not leave. With no choice, the Knights left Hungary. But the German settlers in the once lightly populated region would remain. Ultimately, Transylvania would grow into a major region thanks to the efforts of these settlers as well as Hungarians and Romanians. Though Transylvania would thrive, it, and Hungary in general, immediately suffered upon the expulsion of the Knights. The expulsion of the Teutonic Order might have prevented the possibility of a powerful state existing within Hungary, but without these Knights, the Cumans soon threatened Hungary once more. The expulsion was obviously devastating to the Knights as well. The Teutonic Order lost its Hungarian territories, for which many Knights had died. The Order had also invested significant amounts of money in fortifying the territories it won. They not only lost men and money, they also lost their reputation and honor. Many nobles viewed the Order as untrustworthy after this expulsion. Without noble support, the Order would lose donations and opportunities. However, all of this changed when a Polish duke offered the Order the chance to redeem itself in Prussia. But before we get to this most significant chapter in the Order's history, I want to comment on something interesting about the Hungarian debacle. You may have noticed I only referred to Urban when talking about the debacle. This is because Carlyle does not include it in his history. Why? I think there are two reasons. Firstly, it is a transition period between the Knights' time in the Levant and Prussia. As Carlyle's book is not about the Knights but rather about broader Prussian history, he likely only wanted to include the most important moments. But I believe that there was a second reason for Hungary's omission. We have seen that Carlyle portrays Grandmaster Hermann von der Salza as a great man of history. Including a major mistake like the Hungarian debacle would have taken away from that. Now, let's get into what you have all been waiting for. Prussia. What exactly was Prussia prior to the Teutonic Knights? The pagan Prussians are an interesting group to examine because they did not write anything about themselves. Historians are dependent on archaeology, linguistics, comparative mythology, and the accounts of Christians to piece together what they were like. Linguistic studies of the few Prussian words assimilated into larger cultures revealed that the Prussians were not Germanic or Slavic. They were a Baltic people, like the pagan Lithuanians, who, like the Prussians, will also play a large part in this history, as you will see later in this video. Being a Baltic people meant that the Prussians' ancestors were the Indo-Europeans who did not migrate during the period of migration. This is in contrast to those who migrated, like the Germanics, Slavs, and other groups. Hence, the Prussian language and culture changed very little for centuries. This is evidenced by their primary religion being a development of Indo-European nature worship instead of any form of Christianity. This means their religion was very similar to the pre-Christian Greek, Roman, Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic religions. Urban notes that the Prussian religion was not entirely insular from the outside world. It adopted some religious ideas from the Vikings, who were Norse Germanic pagans, when that group entered Prussian lands. But that is still within the realm of Indo-European paganism, and thus not too different from their native religion. However, Urban claims that the Prussians also adopted some Christian ideas from Catholics and the Orthodox Rus. Regarding the Prussian way of life, the highest class was the warrior nobility, who made their wealth through raiding, hunting, and the work of those whom they enslaved. In contrast, the average Prussian lived off of hunting and farming. Christians claimed that the slavery done by the higher class was one of the reasons that their crusades against the Prussians were justified. However, Urban believes that that was just a cover for expansion because he notes that Christians would sell captured pagans to slavers. In regards to geography, the domain of the pagan Baltic people in general once stretched from the Baltic Sea to Moscow, but it had shrunken significantly as the Slavs expanded. By the time the Teutonic Knights came to Prussia, the Baltic peoples only reigned from Prussia to Livonia. The reason for the major decline of the Balts was their difficulty in uniting against common foes, as unlike most other Europeans, they did not have an established feudal system. The Prussians in particular, they were instead divided into 11 tribes. Despite this general trend of decline, the Prussians held onto their territory with great success. They had once faced the Vikings, and Carlyle and Urban both agree that while Christians, whether Danes or Poles, had been trying to Christianize Prussia for hundreds of years, they had achieved almost zero success. Interestingly, the reason for crusading against the Prussians was not solely a fear of paganism. Urban notes in his article, Victims of the Baltic Crusade, that the papacy believed that the Orthodox Rus would convert the Prussians who lived near them to Eastern Orthodox Christianity if they were not first converted to Catholicism. Essentially, the Catholic world felt that it was only a matter of time before the Prussians, instead of serving their relatively small tribal structure, would become fuel for a much stronger and larger rival in the form of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So the Crusades in Prussia are not simply a Christian versus pagan event, but also a church versus church event. Urban's overall view on the conflict between the Christians and pagan Prussians and the similar pagan Lithuanians is fairly nuanced. He believes that both the Christians and pagans took actions that furthered the conflict. For example, he notes that lands that Christian settlers believed were empty were the pagans' hunting grounds and sacred sites of nature. In response to the expansion of Christians into their lands, the pagans believed that it was justified to plunder any Christian state. Urban also believes that Christian missionaries and pagan shamans were both intolerant and that neither would accept losing religious authority over the people of the region. Regardless of the motivations of both sides, Urban believes that all the aggression the Prussians faced transformed them from a once kind people who valued hospitality into a much less cheerful people. These hardened Prussians would be the ones the Teutonic Knights would face when they came to the region. Okay, so how did the Teutonic Knights end up in Prussia? Well, the Polish Duke Conrad of Masovia invited the Teutonic Knights to crusade against the pagan Prussians. They bordered his realm and had been enslaving his subjects. The timing of the invitation was somewhat awkward. Hermann von der Salza and most of the order's best knights were on crusade with Friedrich II in the Levant. However, it was necessary for the order to act fast, otherwise the Templars or Hospitallers could take the opportunity from them. Thus, Conrad von Landsberg had to gather up the order's newest recruits and those too sick to have gone crusading with the Grand Master. In total, he was only able to bring 7 knights, between 70 to 100 squires and sergeants, as well as some servants, doctors, and priests. A difficult task lay ahead of Conrad and the rest of the order. After all, none of the previous invaders of Prussia had succeeded. Given this context, it makes sense that the part of Prussia that Conrad von Landsberg arrived in was Culm, the safest place for the order. Earlier Polish invasions of the region had resulted in an overall depopulation, with some of the remaining Prussians becoming Christians and being tied to Duke Conrad of Masovia. Now is a good time to look at how the Teutonic Knights viewed their enemy. What kind of religion did the Teutonic Order think the Prussians had? According to one of the order's most successful chroniclers, Peter von Dorsberg, of the 14th century, the Prussians, quote, took erroneously all creations for gods, such as the sun, the moon, the stars, thunder, birds, and even animals, and so on right down to the toads. They had forests, fields, and sacred waters in which no one was allowed to cut down trees, plow, or fish. End quote. Interestingly, as noted by Urban, Duisberg interprets Prussian paganism as a kind of inverted Catholicism, likely because his own worldview was a Catholic one. He claims that, quote, in a place called Romau, which owed its name to Rome, dwelt a man named Crive, whom they honored as a pope, since just as the pope rules over all the faithful of the church, so he ruled over not only this one people, but also over the Lithuanians and the many nations of Livonia. End quote. It should also be mentioned that Peter von Duisberg viewed the Prussians as extremely primitive and in need of civilization. Carlyle takes the same perspective, but as we have seen earlier, Urban did not view them like that. Urban simply viewed them as not utilizing the feudal system. But back to what the knights were doing. Shortly after arriving in Culm, Conrad von Landsberg built a castle named Vogelsang. Violence immediately followed. Conrad set out from his castle with knights. He killed Prussian warriors and destroyed pagan villages, only offering to stop if they converted to Christianity. However, Urban notes that, lacking fighting men, Conrad did not seek to expand. Instead, he was primarily conducting reconnaissance. He wanted to know how the Prussians fought, what their customs were, and how to understand their language. Then, once he received reinforcements from the Teutonic Order, they would have the upper hand. However, if they wanted reinforcements, the knights in Prussia had to build more castles and obtain more food to feed the new arrivals. The Grand Master only sent as many men as could be adequately cared for. Additionally, it is worth noting that according to Urban, Prussia was the least important zone of operations for Hermann von der Salza at this time. Nevertheless, once a truce had been established in the Levant, Hermann von der Salza no longer needed as many knights in Acre and so sent some to Prussia. Thus, in 1230, Master Hermann Balck arrived in Vogelsang with the reinforcements that Conrad von Landsberg had been waiting for. Master Balck worked easily with Germans, Poles, and Prussians so long as they were Christians. For the pagans, he had little mercy. But before beginning the expansion into Prussia, Master Balck ensured that he did not repeat the mistake the Grand Master had made in Hungary. He sought to receive a concrete guarantee of sovereignty from Duke Conrad of Masovia. He wanted something akin to the Holy Roman Emperor's 1226 Golden Bull of Rimini. That agreement ensured that the empire recognized the Teutonic Order's claim to the land it would conquer in Prussia. What happened during the negotiations with the Polish Duke is contested. Some historians conclude that Master Balck established the Order's right to the land, whereas others believe he did not. Tomasz Jasinski goes further than other skeptics. He argues that the Golden Bull of Rimini was only issued in 1235 and backdated to 1226. So according to Jasinski's view then, the knights only had a retroactive right to the land via the Holy Roman Empire. Furthermore, they never had any rights to the land from the Duke according to this view. In contrast, Urban concludes that whatever agreement was reached with the Duke was at least good enough to satisfy Master Balck. Nevertheless, what followed is certain. Only shortly after the agreement was signed, Crusader armies consisting of Germans, Poles, and even Prussian nobles and militiamen who sided with the Crusaders and actually accounted for a large share of the fighters, launched an attack against Prussia. They quickly overran the westernmost Prussian tribes. After this, Crusades in Prussia became a yearly phenomenon, and every time the Order's territory grew. Poles contributed a large portion of the Crusaders during the early years. However, the Teutonic Knights were still vital. They held on to the territory won when the Poles returned home during the fall. To hold this territory, the Knights utilized castles as they had in Hungary, making it difficult for the Prussians to strike back. The Teutonic Knights were perfect for holding onto these lands. Firstly, they had done this in the Levant and Hungary, and so were already experienced. Secondly, their extreme discipline, which arose from their harsh routine and vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, made holding watch during the wet seasons and the cold nights bearable. However, eventually, the importance of the Teutonic Knights grew greater as the Polish contributions faded over time. This occurred because conflicts between Polish dukes arose. This caused the Poles to expend their efforts fighting each other rather than the Prussians. What did fighting look like in Prussia? Well, it varied dramatically between the seasons. In the summer, the Prussians could easily hide amongst the woods and swamps, giving them the advantage. However, in the winter, the cover of nature vanished, and the technologically outmatched Prussians could not hide from heavy cavalry and crossbows. Both Carlyle and Urban agree that unlike previous Christian attempts, the Order achieved major success, effectively conquering Prussia. However, the historians disagree about what this success meant. Carlyle states, quote, "Conversion and complete conquest once come, there was a happy time for Prussia. Plowshare instead of sword, busy sea havens, German towns getting built, churches everywhere rising, grass growing, and peaceable cows, where formerly had been quagmire and snakes." End quote. Urban also acknowledged this state building, but he also highlighted the violence committed against the Prussians, such as the killing of villagers. The crusade against the Prussians would ultimately contribute to the Old Prussian language vanishing, and the arrival of German and Polish settlers resulted in the survivors assimilating into either of those cultures. But while all this was going on in Prussia, the Teutonic Knights were also heavily invested in another part of the Baltic, Livonia, which covers modern Estonia and Latvia. They entered the Second Front in 1237, only 7 years after they first arrived in Prussia. The entry of the Teutonic Order into this region was completely different from how they had entered Prussia. Rather than being invited, they instead took up another order's responsibilities in the region. What happened was that another German crusading order, the Sword Brothers, had suffered a terrible defeat in Livonia in 1236. This prompted the Sword Brothers to meet with Hermann von der Salza. Together, they agreed that they would ask Pope Gregory IX to transfer all Sword Brothers and their assets into the Teutonic Order. Though they wanted to be a part of the Teutonic Order, they ensured in the negotiations that they were to remain as an autonomous branch called the Livonian Order. The Pope agreed to this arrangement, and suddenly the Teutonic Order had a presence in Livonia, though obviously weak and in need of strengthening. Here, both Urban and Carlyle's opposing methods of writing history meet. Was it the circumstance of the defeat of the Sword Brothers that brought the Teutonic Order to Livonia, or would that have led to nothing were it not for the great man Hermann von der Salza's diplomacy? Regardless of what conclusion you come to, an interesting dynamic certainly came into play during this crusade. The Livonian pagans had Orthodox Rus to their east and Roman Catholics to their west. Interestingly, Urban argues that the Rus actually viewed Roman Catholics worse than they viewed pagans, as they believed that a pope being the head of the church was a greater threat. Additionally, the fact that during the Fourth Crusade, Catholics had taken over Constantinople meant that Rus was the last holdout of orthodoxy, making Catholics believe that the fall of Rus would reunite Christendom. This desire for a united Catholic Christendom contributed to the famous battle on the ice in 1242. William of Modena, a papal legate, believed defeating Novgorod would achieve the aforementioned goal of reuniting Christendom. However, he ultimately failed. Interestingly, Urban argues that this battle has been heavily misunderstood. Many people believe that the Teutonic Order was the main force during the battle, but Urban claims they only played a small role in that battle. Like the belief that the Teutonic Knights had horns, this misconception also likely came from Eisenstein's movie Alexander Nevsky. Some of this hostility between the Catholics and the Orthodox was counterbalanced by the possibility of lucrative trade with each other. Nevertheless, the underlying differences between the two groups of Christians gave the pagan Livonians an advantage that the pagan Prussians did not have. They could play both sides against each other to maintain their own position. But despite having this advantage that the Prussians lacked, the Knights would eventually manage to subdue the Livonians as well. Though the Knights managed to incorporate Livonia into their state, we will now shift back to focusing primarily on Prussia, for that is the region where the Knights had the greatest impact. While the Order's military aspect was needed to gain its lands, its state building was what allowed for the creation of the Prussia that would unify Germany in the future. Thus, we will leave military matters behind for some time to focus on how the Teutonic Order successfully turned its lands into a functioning state. One of the most important issues that the Teutonic Knights needed to solve was that of population. Prussia was not densely populated to begin with, and the Prussian population had massively decreased as a result of all the crusades inflicted against them. Furthermore, not all of the survivors had integrated into the Christian culture that the rest of Europe had adopted. To non-Christians, the Order's systems of governance were essentially invalid. After all, the Order derived all of its authority from the Pope. So, like in Transylvania, the Order brought Christian settlers into the previously pagan region. These settlers were usually German or Polish and of various professions. For example, in Culm, one of the earliest Prussian regions they entered, they settled mainly Polish secular knights. This was most likely because these knights were effective at defending their possessions against the Prussians, who were more formidable in the early days. But they also enticed German burghers to found new towns that could bolster the region's economy with the 1233 Charter of Culm. This charter guaranteed the rights of these burghers in the region. Many of the cities the Order either helped create or seized are quite famous today. Two of the most important and earliest cities were Marienburg and Königsberg. Königsberg was founded on the 1st of September 1255, originally as a fortress. The Order built Königsberg Castle here, which they quickly upgraded from wood to stone. Marienburg may have been founded earlier in the 13th century or later in the late 13th century. Regardless, by the end of the earliest years of the 14th century, it was the state's capital, and it became home to the newly constructed Marienburg Castle. This castle is still the largest brick-built castle in the world today. Why did the Knights build this castle out of brick rather than stone, as in Königsberg? That was because Marienburg lacked adequate stone, but there was a lot of mud that could make good red brick. One of the most important cities for trade was the port of Danzig. This was originally called Gdansk and was a part of Poland. However, in 1308, the Polish Duke Ladislaw asked the Teutonic Knights to reclaim the city after it had been conquered by the forces of the Margrave of Brandenburg. The Knights successfully defeated the Brandenburgers. William Urban's perspective on what followed is completely different from the usual view. Most argued that the Teutonic Knights then betrayed the Polish garrison, killing them along with many citizens. Then they destroyed much of the city so that they could rebuild it firmly under their own control. Urban instead defends the Knights. This is surprising, as we have seen earlier that he does not shy away from describing their atrocities against the pagans. Urban's defense, likely then, is not out of being sympathetic to the order, but rather due to his analysis. He claims that the Knights only killed citizens after they started an uprising. This uprising was in response to fears that the Teutonic Order's religious discipline meant that they had higher expectations as to how much suffering the average subject could bear via high taxes. The reason for the Order's harsh response to the uprising was that German merchants had been killed during it. As we have seen earlier, German merchants and burghers had been one of the main tools the Order had used to build up their state, and thus the Knights needed them safe and sound. Another way Urban challenges the traditional narrative is that he argues that the Duke's claim of a death toll of 10,000 must be exaggerated because this was much more than the city's population at the time. Beyond this, Urban also defends the Order by presenting its takeover of the city as necessary. He claims that the only advantage for the Polish Duke in possessing the city was that it allowed him to put pressure on the Teutonic Order. Urban says the city had too few taxpayers to increase the Duke's yield in any substantial way, yet despite this financial weakness, Urban claims the city allowed the Duke to effectively make the Teutonic Order dependent on him. This was because having Gdansk and broader Pomerelia allowed him to block the Teutonic Knights from bringing people and resources into Prussia. This effectively meant that the Teutonic Order relied on the Duke's goodwill. Another interesting aspect of Urban's view is that he believes the Teutonic Knights were not paid the money they were promised for taking back Gdansk. The usual view is that the Teutonic Knights claimed that they did not get paid as an excuse for their actions. Urban instead claims that the Knights captured all the fortresses within the region as leverage to ensure that they got paid. However, Urban claims they were not paid because the Duke lacked money and believed the Knights were supposed to serve him just for the sake of serving him. While Urban admits the Knights had many reasons to take the city, it is interesting to see that he believes they were genuinely taken advantage of. This was definitely one of the more surprising parts of Urban's book, as his stance is completely different from most on this issue. However, Urban agrees with other historians on what followed the capture of Gdansk, afterwards more commonly referred to as German name Danzig, that the takeover utterly ruined the relationship between Poland and the Teutonic Knights, setting the stage for years of conflict instead of the cooperation that had preceded it. The Order's possession of so many bustling cities like Danzig and their appealing policies meant that by the 13th and especially during the 14th century, immigrants to their state were considerable. By this time, the original Prussians were far fewer in number, and the state took actions to assimilate them into Christian and German culture. Notably, the state passed laws that encouraged its subjects to teach the surviving Prussians how to speak German. One would assume this was purely about assimilation in and of itself. It was partly. The Teutonic State believed that the Prussian language was heavily linked to paganism. Thus, if the Prussians spoke German, the state believed they would likely become Christians. But Urban notes the main reason for these laws was actually that the state believed that if the Prussians assimilated into German culture, they could be taxed more. This was because the German system of communal three-field farming produced more taxable produce than the Prussian system of two-field solitary farms. I will quickly explain the difference between these two systems of farming so you can understand why switching to a three-field system was seen as beneficial from a taxation perspective. A two-field system involved planting wheat, barley, or rye on only half the field. Not planting anything in half of the field allowed for that soil to recover. In contrast, the three-field system instead left only a third of the field unplanted. This was because the three-field farming system added legumes, which naturally strengthened the soil. This meant that more food could be harvested, and because it was more varied, the diet it provided was healthier. More goods means more taxes, and healthier people means longer lives, and thus more taxes paid before death. Thus, Urban's argument that the spreading of the German way of life was largely intended to increase state growth seems probable. An interesting side fact is that while the Prussians were becoming Germans, German immigrants to neighboring Poland were becoming Polish at the same time. It is interesting to think about how much the policies of a state can affect the transformation of one's identity. We touched on economics when talking about the founding of cities and the spreading of German culture. Regarding the economy, the state primarily exported grain, beer, wood, fur, honey, and amber. In exchange, they received Western European fish and salt, as well as cloth and iron from the Flemish, as well as wool from Scandinavia and England. Additionally, it should be noted that the Teutonic State was not only a part of the famous Hanseatic League, but arguably its leading member. The Teutonic State suffered when the League suffered, so they put a great deal of effort into stopping piracy in the Baltic Sea. This eventually led to the 1398 war in Gotland. Pirates known as the Vidal brothers had been using Gotland Island as a base. In response, Grandmaster Conrad von Jungenen ordered 84 ships to the island. 4,000 men and 400 horses disembarked from these ships. The pirates, fearing defeat, signed an armistice that would see them leave the island. In this way, the Teutonic State defeated a major economic threat and took control of a strategic island. One constant thorn in the order's side throughout their arrival in the Baltic and their period of state building was the Lithuanians. The Lithuanians were creating their own state right in between the order's holdings in Prussia and Livonia. Urban argues that the initial purpose of the Teutonic Order's fight against the Lithuanians was to secure a route of communication between the separated Prussia and Livonia. Only later did it evolve into a crusade with the intention of converting all Lithuanians to Christianity. However, a major problem for the Knights' legitimacy was when the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogila, not only converted to Catholicism, but also became the King of Poland under the name Ladislaw by marrying the Queen of Poland in 1386. This one action took away the Teutonic Order's reason for crusading and united one long-term enemy with a recently lost ally. Here we see a somewhat interesting turn of events. The papacy had feared that the pagans were at risk of being drawn into the Orthodox world. Instead, the pagans were ultimately brought into the Catholic world, yet in a way that left one of the papacy's most effective orders purposeless and surrounded by enemies. You are probably wondering how the Teutonic Order was able to build such a powerful state in the Baltic without facing resistance from larger powers until much later. Urban has an interesting explanation. It was not so much excellent diplomacy or political maneuvering on behalf of the Knights, but rather due to the Mongols. Between 1236 and 1242, Rus, Poland, and Hungary were devastated by a Mongol invasion, only to be barely saved by the death of the Grand Khan, which prompted the Mongols to leave and take part in the election of a successor. Only one state within Rus remained independent, Novgorod. Hungary lost much of its population. The situation in Poland would be the most important for the Knights, as Poland was the state with which they had the closest interaction. The Mongols had left Poland on the brink of collapse. Poland would remain in this catastrophic state for the following 70 years. This meant that the Poles could not take the fight to the Prussians without the support of the Teutonic Knights. We have seen earlier how the Poles had to fight alongside the Teutonic Knights when before they used to conduct crusades on their own. So overall, the Mongol invasion made Poland much more dependent on the Knights, as the Teutonic Knights were a formidable military force with the resources to bring the fight to the pagan Prussians, and thus relieve pressure on Poland. Furthermore, as the Teutonic Knights settled Germans and Poles on the lands they conquered, they effectively eliminated the chance that pagans could launch attacks on Poland from these conquered territories. The shift in the balance of power following the Mongol invasion perfectly explains how Poland lost Danzig to the Brandenburgers and then to the Teutonic Knights without being able to take it back. However, as we saw earlier, through a clever marriage alliance, a resurgent Poland now had control over the military might of Lithuania. The balance of power had fundamentally changed. The Knights needed to recognize that the new Poland was not the old Poland, and that they needed to tread carefully moving forward. However, catastrophically for the Knights, they did not, as we will see in the next section. The cities that had built the state's economic foundation were also responsible for its downfall. This was because, as these cities grew stronger, they wanted to escape their taxes and obligations to the Teutonic Order. The Order had always taxed its subjects. As we have seen earlier, they had a reputation for believing the average subject could handle high taxation because their own discipline elevated their belief in how much hardship others could bear. Furthermore, Urban argues that between 1310 and 1350, the Teutonic Knights underwent significant change, a change that would require more financial fuel in the form of taxes. Essentially, during this time period, the Knights became akin to wealthy lords, not monks. They no longer emphasized monasticism as heavily and instead adopted chivalry, typically associated with secular knights. While chivalry had many aspects well aligned with the Knights, like generosity and honor, Urban claims that the chivalrous lifestyle was highly expensive due to the need to display generosity by hosting banquets and the like. While chivalry was overall very popular and contributed greatly to crusading morale, the tax burden of living under the Knights would later enable Poland to position itself as a more beneficial overlord. And so, the wealthy cities began to wait for the moment they could align themselves with Poland instead of the Teutonic Order. That chance came in 1410 when the Order lost the Battle of Grunwald against Polish and Lithuanian forces, leaving it militarily weakened. When the cities recognized the Knights had failed to recover after more than 40 years, they rebelled against the Order in 1454. The ensuing 13 Years' War resulted in the Order losing Western Prussia to Poland and the Grand Master of the remaining Eastern Prussia becoming a vassal of Poland. This created a danger for the Order. East Prussia was severed from the rest of Germany, and even here they were no longer independent. Furthermore, as a result of this loss, the Order also lost its capital of Marienburg. Thus, they even had to move their headquarters to Königsberg Castle. While these blows left the Order greatly weakened and jarred, it was still formidable. That is why its ultimate collapse only came from within, not from without. The events that prompted this collapse began in the 16th century when the German monk Martin Luther was outraged by what he saw as corruption in the Catholic Church. Luther did not originally intend to replace the Catholic Church, but the struggle which caused a larger Protestant Reformation affecting more than just Germany would ultimately lead him to create Lutheran Christianity. And during the Protestant Reformation, the Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg converted to Lutheranism. With his conversion, he made the Order's land secular. The Teutonic State was gone. Its lands now belonged to the Duchy of Prussia, not the Teutonic Order. And the former Grand Master was now Duke over these lands. Surprisingly, this massive change was not as controversial within the Order as one would think. Urban notes that many members of the Order grew up in a German environment where anger at perceived corruption within the Catholic Church was at an absolute boiling point. Furthermore, many knights were also furious that Pope Clement VII had chosen to appoint one of his relatives as a bishop over part of their lands. One particularly important thing is that Martin Luther specifically sent a message to the Teutonic Knights to avoid, quote, false chastity, end quote. This is of utmost significance. Remember, the Teutonic Knights were not to have children. This meant that for these knights, converting to Protestantism was a pathway to transitioning the land the Order had gained during the Crusades into hereditary possessions. Essentially, Protestantism would allow the knights to become landed aristocrats. With this context, it is not surprising that the Grand Master was able to successfully convert what was left of the Teutonic State to Protestant Prussia. But not all the knights in the Baltic converted to Protestantism. Remember, the branch of the Teutonic Order in Livonia, the Livonian Order, was autonomous, and they utilized this independence to remain Catholic. But the same fate as the Prussian branch ultimately awaited them. They were fatally weakened when Ivan the Terrible invaded Livonia. The master of the Livonian Order, recognizing his weakness, dissolved it and secularized the former order's land holdings, some of which he still controlled as a duke. However, he let these lands be vassalized by Poland because he needed protection, and Ivan's reputation, as his moniker the Terrible suggests, was not someone many of the knights wanted to serve. While the Teutonic Order lost its state that once included Prussia and Livonia, it persisted in Catholic regions of the Holy Roman Empire, providing military service primarily to the Habsburg dynasty. However, many years later, in 1806, Napoleon defeated the Holy Roman Empire, bringing many German states into his Confederation of the Rhine. This caused the Holy Roman Empire's collapse. This was not good for the Order. Napoleon had been removing remnants of the old medieval world from the territories he occupied, and it followed that in 1809, he ultimately stripped the Teutonic Order of any remaining territories from the German states he occupied. Thereafter, the Order only persisted in Austria. This was because the former Holy Roman Emperor remained here as Emperor of Austria. Today, the Order still exists in Austria, having been transformed into a charitable Catholic order. But the history of the Teutonic Order does not truly end with them being confined to Austria. The state of Prussia would never have existed without the Knights. Thus, the effects of that state on history can be attributed directly to the Knights. And so, this video does not yet end. We will now look at what secularized Prussia went on to do and how, throughout its existence, it remained fundamentally linked to the Teutonic Knights who had created it. The Duchy of Prussia would gradually merge with and incorporate distant German states into itself, becoming more and more powerful. As it grew, it eventually became the Kingdom of Prussia, one of the most important European states in history. From this state comes the modern education system, among many other important innovations. Leopold von Ranke, the man who transformed history as a subject mentioned earlier in this video, was a professor in Berlin, which replaced Königsberg as Prussia's capital. Additionally, Prussia would come under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, recognized as one of the greatest statesmen of all time. Bismarck would defeat Prussia's rival, Austria, as well as Denmark and France, in a series of wars that allowed him to bring the various German states that had been left disunited following the destruction of the Holy Roman Empire under Prussian leadership. Thus, the German Empire was born, and the balance of power in Europe was forever changed. Before, Central Europe had been full of disunited German states that found themselves serving larger states. They often even found themselves fighting against their fellow German states. Instead, following unification, this disunity was replaced by arguably the strongest state on the European continent. And Prussia, even after unifying Germany, maintained many links to the past. Prussia's famous land-owning aristocratic class, the Junkers, were descended from knights who had settled on lands in the Teutonic State. Highly symbolic, the Hohenzollern Kaisers who ruled the German Empire were of the same family as the former Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg, who converted Prussia into a secular possession. A very unique relationship is the one between Prussia and Poland. We have seen that it was Poland who put a great deal of effort into crusading in Prussia in the first place, and that it was also Poland that brought the knights to Prussia. But we also saw how the night seizure of Danzig put a rift between the two. Then we saw how Poland later took control of Western Prussia and made the rest of Prussia its vassal state. This constantly changing dynamic continues following the end of the Teutonic State. Eventually, secular Prussia would divide Poland between itself, Austria, and Russia. Thus, it can be said that Poland helped create Prussia, Poland almost destroyed Prussia, and Prussia destroyed Poland. The story of the Teutonic Knights is certainly quite dramatic. The death of the German Holy Roman Emperor left the Germans abandoned to disease beneath the walls of Acre in the Levant, so distant from their homeland. Yet, in this utter misery, merchants came together to form a hospital to take care of the sick, and they were so successful that the Pope recognized them as an official Catholic order. But another pope would change the Teutonic Order into an order of knights when the new emperor, like his father, died on crusade, leaving the German crusaders in need of men. This military order would continue to fight in the Levant until the end of crusading in that region. But their destiny ultimately lay in the Baltic, where they conquered Prussia and Livonia and created a powerful state. While they would ultimately lose the faith of their subjects, leading to their defeat and vassalization by Poland, the Teutonic Order's destiny had yet to be fully achieved. Like a phoenix, the order was reduced to ashes in Prussia when the Grand Master converted to Protestantism. However, from these ashes, the new secular state of Prussia would rise. This new state was fundamentally imbued with the essence of the Teutonic Order via its monarchy and nobility. Otto von Bismarck would wield this creation of the Teutonic Order to achieve one of the greatest political feats of all time, the unification of Germany into perhaps the most powerful state on the European continent. With all that in mind, it is no wonder that Thomas Carlyle saw the Teutonic Knights as even more historically important than the Knights Templar.